Yes.
Dr. Kostyaski, thank you very much for the talk. I loved it very much. It was very enriching. I have so many things I want to ask you, so I'm going to restrain myself a little. This idea of turning ourselves back to God is something that resonates very strongly with me, I'm sure, for all of us. I've had the very good fortune and the great pleasure of studying the liturgy for many years, reading many liturgical books. And I enjoy it, and it's been very enriching, but one thing I have to remind myself from time to time is that this isn't just merely academic study. This is, in fact, at some point, turning to God and offering Him due worship. In like manner, the current crisis in which we find ourselves in the church, I have a similar reaction insofar as we often see with the materially heretical statements coming out of Rome from time to time, a kind of a reaction of, why isn't somebody doing something? Why isn't this person saying something? Why? And so, and one of my favorite commentators has well commented that there is nobody coming to save us. The Cardinal Burkes are not coming to save us. Cardinal Sarah is not coming to save us. Bishop Schneider is not coming to save us. And that was very meaningful to me because it made me realize it is Christ who's coming to save us. And it is us who need to turn to Christ to seek the solution out of these problems. And
yes.
Not out of men. Not that they may not be good men in their own right. I'm not picking on them individually. Do you see it the same way? Is this how you view this current situation?
I do. I see it exactly the way that you described it. The church is in a state of perpetual crisis. The only question is it a serious crisis or not such a serious crisis? I mean, historically speaking, one thing that has been really important for me over the years is studying church history. I feel the need to learn more and more about church history, and when I go deep into the Middle Ages or into the Dark Ages, I think there's a legitimate use of that phrase that doesn't belong to the Black legend. When you look at the church at the end of the first millennium, it was a mess. It was a serious mess. You don't have a doctor of the church, St. Peter Damian, writing an entire treatise against sodomy if the church is not a mess. And that was in the 10th century or something, somewhere right around there. So things have always been a mess. However, what is unique to our times, really I think unique to the 20th century, is that for the first time, the fundamental means with which Christians could deal with the crisis were themselves altered or even taken away. And that's the reason why a certain resistance among Catholics was absolutely necessary. And I thank the Lord for having bestowed on me the unmerited privilege of discovering the tradition of the church and the power of her liturgy, the power of her sacraments, the power of her theology, because after all, there was a time when St. Thomas Aquinas was verboten, right? Nobody could study Aquinas. That was old-fashioned stuff. Having discovered all these treasures of our tradition, it seems to me that our obligation right now is very clear, and that is to live a holy life with these resources that we have, that Christ has given us, as well as we can, to promote them, to be evangelistic about it, right? We should be like Scott Hahn's of tradition. We should be out there really promoting these things. Of course, Scott Hahn himself now attends the traditional Latin Mass. I don't know how many people know that. But, and so, we need to be serious about it ourselves. We need to be evangelistic. We need to be apologetic in the classical sense of the word, right? Knowing how to respond to objections, how to argue our points. We also, of course, need to judge our audiences. I mean, some of the things I said today, I wouldn't say to everybody. That is, different people are prepared for different amounts of critique. But I agree. We can't put our hopes on any particular man, right? Scripture says, cursed is he who puts his trust in man. That's right there in the Old Testament, right? So we can't. We can rely on God to raise up heroes like Bishop Schneider, who is like his namesake, St. Athanasius. But even in the time of St. Athanasius, it wasn't St. Athanasius who saved the church. He was just a willing accomplice and instrument for Christ, right? So I agree with what you're saying. Yes.
Peter, you have to do is present a good example, otherwise we're clanging gongs. But another thing that's happened, or is happening, and has gotten worse, I know, over my lifetime, and I don't have any direct experience with anything other than that, is that it seems like the intellectual life is decreasing amongst the general population, and certainly amongst the young people, especially those who are in public school programs. And so my question is, you went to Thomas Aquinas College, and also you were a professor now at Wyoming Catholic. What do you see? I'm sure you receive entrance exams, or rather entrance applications from people who maybe haven't, or students who haven't come out of say a classical high school curriculum of any sorts. What sort of spark or clue do you find in the applications? What are you looking for that says, you know what, this person doesn't have a great background intellectually or educationally, but there's something there that makes me think this person will be successful in a true intellectual life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that I have noticed in my life is that in every way things seem to be getting more polarized. I mean, that's obviously the case with Republicans and Democrats in the United States, and as we saw in the recent bitter election campaigns and their aftermath. But I also mean that when you look at the Newman Guide colleges, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, but the Newman Guide has a certain list of colleges that they sort of pre-approve, as places that are seriously Catholic, or at least striving to be. And it's not a very long list, considering the number of institutions there are. But if you look at the kind of students who are going to those institutions, they really, I mean, at least half of them are homeschooled, and at least talking about the American context. And those that are not homeschooled probably went to a charter school or a private school. Very few public school applicants that we see. I just don't think the intellectual wherewithal is there. I mean, a kid who goes to a public high school typically is not interested in reading Homer and Dante and Shakespeare and Aristotle and things like that, right? Which is what our students do. It's a great books college. So we have our students write a couple of entrance essays. One of the essays is talk about the role of beauty in the Christian life. And that's a very interesting essay topic because it forces a person, it's not, in a way, it's not an academic topic. It's more of an existential topic. What do you think is beautiful? What is beauty? What's the role that it should play in your life? And you can tell a lot about somebody by what they say, even if it's immature because it's a 17-year-old or something. They either get it or they don't. So it's amazing if they think that the beautiful is very important and they can say a few good things about it, then that's already a sign of sort of raw material that is going to work for our college. The other essay we asked them to write is, why do you want to come and study for 4 years and read hundreds of great books? Why do you want to do that? Because for most people, just reading itself isn't even a pastime anymore. I mean, people don't read books. I like to talk about these funny contraptions made up of wood pulp and glue, and like to sort of describe what a book is. We're probably going to get to that point someday. But again, if they can say, no, I love to read. I read Chesterton and I read Lewis, and and I like reading mystery novels, and I mean whatever they say. If they have a serious reading life, then that's already a sign that they'll be able to do well in our curriculum because it's a heavily great books-based curriculum. I don't know if there's a further comment I have about the general cultural decline. I think it's obvious that it's happening, and I sort of share. I don't know if any of you are fans of Robert Hugh Benson's books, but he's one of the greatest Catholic authors of modern times. If you haven't read his books, you should read his books. But I'm sort of with Benson. Benson is both hugely pessimistic and hugely optimistic at the same time, somehow. He has a book called The Lord of the World, which is really terrifyingly apocalyptic, and he sees everything as declining and obviously going to hell in a handbasket, and yet Christ still triumphs. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I don't have any, certainly don't have any easy solutions. I just think we need to hold fast. Do what St. Paul says, right? Hold fast to what's been handed down to you. That's what you need to do. Yeah. And let God sort out the rest.
People are always, newcomers to our parish are always shocked at the number of young people we have coming. A lot of preconceptions are that it's going to be a row after row of gray hairs. So people are genuinely shocked when they see the young families and the number of kids who come to the traditional Latin Mass. Similarly, it seems Francis has been shocked by this as well with his recent comments. Do you have any input or anything enlightening to say to this?
Oh, I knew somebody was going to ask about that, but thank you for. Yeah, I think that just to speak bluntly, I think Pope Francis doesn't get it about a lot of things, but particularly about the phenomenon of traditionalism. It doesn't seem to be something that ever played any kind of serious role in his life as a bishop or as a priest. He seems to have known a few SSPX people in Argentina, and he said sort of stiffly polite things about them once in a, that they were, that they came and asked him for permission to do various things. So, but it just seems like so much on the periphery. And at the same time, he's a Jesuit formed in the 60s and 70s, which is just about the nadir, the lowest point that theology has ever seen in the history of the West, probably. So I just think he doesn't have a very good training. You can see that in his interview responses. Whenever he responds to things, he's lacking all the distinctions that a well-trained person would be able to make. Hope I'm not scandalizing anybody by saying these things, but it's clear when you read the transcripts that he doesn't have a very good formation in philosophy or theology. So that brings us to his comments. It's a strange thing, but people of a certain generation, especially if they have the mentality of the 1970s, they can't get it through their heads, through their skulls, that you could ever be attracted to the Latin liturgy from anything except nostalgia. And even their understanding of nostalgia, I would say, is a fairly narrow one. It's a particular type or flavor of nostalgia. But I mean, nostalgia itself is a fascinating phenomenon, and I have an article about this on NLM where I talk about nostalgia is a much bigger phenomenon than what these people mean by it. They just mean a sort of emotional hankering after the good old days or something like that. And so when they see the young people flocking to the Fraternity of St. Peter parishes or the Institute of Christ the King parishes, they can't make any sense out of it. It's almost as if like the mental highways are not there down which they could go, right? And maybe that's because just the very notion of tradition doesn't really mean very much anymore to people from that generation, right? I think if the Pope said something very telling, he quoted St. Vincent of Lerins in this interview, saying that the dogma of the Christian religion develops over time. And he quoted that as if to explain why everybody should be on board with the liturgical reform. I mean, it is a complete disconnect. St. Vincent of Lerins, in context, is saying that the dogmas of the faith never change in their essence, but they develop in their mode of exposition. And so it's not really directly a comment on whether the liturgical reform was successful or whether the old traditions actually have more beauty, more reverence, more attractiveness to them. So maybe it's just as well that Pope Francis doesn't know the traditionalists intimately, because I don't know what he would do if he saw the buckles on the shoes of the Institute of Christ the King clergy. I think he would just... Never mind. Yes?
I noticed that you, thank you. I noticed that you took care to mention the Eastern liturgies, and I don't know what the numbers are, but I would imagine there's something like 10 times as many Eastern parishes as there are parishes which celebrate the traditional Latin Mass in North America. And I'm wondering what we as Roman Catholics and what we as people concerned about liturgy and renewal of the liturgy people should think about and should consider doing in terms of helping or
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The Eastern liturgical tradition has largely remained intact all the way down to the present period. I mean, it's frightening to me, but there are people at the Vatican who keep trying to figure out ways to change the Byzantine Catholic liturgies, but so far they haven't been successful, with the possible exception of the Ruthenian translation that really got messed up some years ago. That's a problem. But for the most part, they've remained intact in their historic form. As I was talking about the scandal of the particular, you can still go to a Byzantine liturgy and experience it in its integrity, in its sort of classic fullness. Unfortunately, I mean, I have, so the Byzantine liturgy in my life has played a huge role, because I used to teach at the International Theological Institute in Austria, where we attended Divine Liturgy almost every day. So we got to be very familiar with it in Old Slavonic, in Ukrainian, Romanian, and English. My son even received First Communion and First Confession in the Byzantine Rite, because unlike with baptism, it's not a problem to do that. So it has a really important place in my heart and in my life. And what I think it did for me, it didn't really alert me to something I didn't already know about the West, but it made me have another lens through which to look at things. So it helped me to appreciate, among other things, the sung liturgy, the importance of singing the liturgy as opposed to just reciting it. My opinion about that now is that one should either have pretty much a silent low mass or a fully sung high mass. But a spoken liturgy, I think, is an aberration, a huge aberration, and it makes no sense whatsoever, liturgically speaking. We can go into that some other time if you want. So I think the East can just teach us all kinds of things: reverence for tradition, and for customs, the importance of singing the liturgy. Those are some things. Of course, they've played an instrumental role just by being a refuge for a lot of Catholics over the past few decades. I mean, I know plenty of people who've just given up on the Roman Catholic diocesan sort of infrastructure and have just gone. So they've gone Byzantine. If only temporarily, not by changing rites. And I think that's certainly been a godsend. I don't know how true it would be to say, at least in the United States, that there are more Byzantine parishes than Tridentine ones. I mean, at this point, the traditional Mass is being celebrated. At least it's over 500 places on Sundays in the United States now, and I don't know how many Byzantine parishes there are, but there aren't that. There aren't. The Byzantine Christians have unfortunately always only been a little tiny percentage of the population, right? So I don't know how the actual numbers compare. I know up here in Canada you have a lot of Ukrainian Catholics, especially, I think, back east. Is that right? Sort of in the eastern parts. So I hope that wasn't really an answer to your question. I think that was more of like a meandering, but
further to the question and the comment around the Byzantine as well, I appreciated your references to the Byzantine liturgy. I'm one of those Catholics who actually tends to celebrate with both lungs, baptized in the Byzantine tradition, but very familiar and involved in the Roman Rite.
Mm-hmm.
You made a comment earlier in your talk about perhaps one of the reasons, or I'm paraphrasing you, so I may not get it exactly right, but with the changes from Vatican II into the new Mass, and that there is no wine, and that may be one of the explanations for why the people are losing their faith, and in fact even leaving the church, that the churches are empty. Definitely in the Vancouver area, without our immigration people, the population, many of our churches would be decimated, totally empty. However, going back to the Byzantine, so I want to say the Eastern rites, including the Orthodox, as you noted, their liturgy has remained intact for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, even preceding the Roman Rite traditional Mass as we know it today.
Yeah.
Right? Yet their churches are empty as well, if not more so.
It's true.
Your comments on that?
Sure. Yeah, no, actually, thank you for asking that, because I meant to say it in response to your question, too. That, on the other hand, one shouldn't romanticize the East, because they have plenty of problems of their own. And oftentimes, with their alliance with the state, maybe the tendency towards a kind of Erastianism and the tendency to sort of get too comfortable with the established order, as happened in Russia, and still is happening in Russia. it can become a kind of cultural heritage. Like, this is the thing we do. This is kind of part of our cultural heritage, but not many people believe it anymore. One of the things that's so beautiful about the Roman tradition is how missionary it is. I mean, the authentic Roman Catholic tradition. If you look back over all the Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, who went everywhere in the world and suffered unspeakable hardships to bring the faith all over the globe, is something that's much rarer in the Eastern tradition. I mean, there's some of it, like you can see it in Alaska with the Orthodox, but generally speaking, the West has been far more missionary, and even they admit that fact. So I think part of the reason why the Western Church has been so healthy over the centuries is that it's had this sort of outward missionary tendency along with a beautiful liturgy. So there's a kind of complementarity there. We have this treasure, but we're also going to bring it to everybody and share it with everybody. And I think something about the Eastern, it's like a blessing and a curse, right? That the East early on decided to go the vernacular route, because then they created the possibility for each sort of national church to become just a sort of epiphenomenon of that people and its culture and the nation. And that I think the Roman tradition has avoided that for a long time by having Latin as its language, not any particular language, and by having one liturgical rite for any people or any culture. I think we've lost a lot of those advantages since we went the vernacular route as well. Right?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree about the missionary, but that's perhaps another topic, because the Eastern churches were into China hundreds and hundreds of years ago, down into South America, etc.
Speak a little louder, please.
Well, I'm not sure about the missionary comment that I agree, but that's probably a different topic. But I guess my question might be, are we so sure that even if the traditional Latin Mass had remained, if it had not been changed at all,
Sure.
in Vatican II, are you so sure that people would not have left the church?
Okay, yeah.
Because
No,
I think in the Orthodox and in the Eastern rites, they didn't change the liturgy at all.
No,
And
it's a great question.
churches are just as empty. The
Here-
families have left.
Yes. Here's the hard truth of the matter, and this is, I mean, now I'm speaking as a philosopher. That's what my academic training is in mainly. I think that modernity is violently anti-Christian. I mean, the more you study the Enlightenment thinkers, the more you see that. So for several hundred years, we've had a kind of systematic campaign to undermine Christianity in the West. And so I actually think that the church was bound to go through a period of purification and loss, a kind of shaking out of extraneous material, of everybody who doesn't actually believe. That was going to happen. It was already happening. The church was declining in certain parts of the world before the Second Vatican Council, even though the liturgy was still intact, at least in some sense. So yeah, I think there was always going to be a loss. This much, though, seems clear to me that there's evidence of millions of people leaving the church right around the time of the liturgical changes. And it's I think there are multiple factors, but I think it would be foolish to deny that one of the factors wasn't the sudden radical change in the mode of worship. I mean, we have documentary evidence from people saying things like, well, if this thing can change, which I was always taught was unchangeable, then everything the church teaches might as well be wrong, or something like that. So I kind of made the point about, if you change the thing that you say is the most important and most sacred and the thing you perceive from tradition, and you change that in a way that looks to people like a radical change, and it was, then you sort of saw the branch off that you're sitting on, right? It's like sawing a branch off while you're sitting on it, right? You can't do that. Once you do that, then you lose all your moral credibility for everything else, in my opinion. So I think that in modern times, the church it's not going to look right now the way it did in the 13th century, right? When everybody was Catholic and Gothic cathedrals were going up everywhere and so on. That's not, in the Lord's, in the mystery of his providential designs, that's not the period we're at right now. We're in a phase of serious attack and assault on the church that I think is going to purge huge numbers of people. But I think the liturgical reforms are all part of that. If you want to ask me, am I willing to say it's the most important part of that? I do think, at least for symbolic reasons, it is the most important thing. So I think that if there's going to be a real path of healing and of restoration, it's going to have to include the liturgy at its heart.
I'd like to ask a question. Father Franco has started out last few weeks to do evangelization at the bus stop. And I felt that I'm converted Catholic. And I felt that Catholic has the key, but I don't see much to evangelization. So what is the role? What is important? What is Catholic then? And we are Catholic, we do the Eucharist, but we do not spread the good news. And then, we can talk about theology, but we're not doing. We're not knocking the door. We're not there and die for Christ because He died for us already. What do you say that?
So I have some friends, or I should say, some students at the college right now. They're friends too, but they're principally students at the moment who are organizing themselves to start. They want to start a. So have you heard of these sort of programs that go around from parish to parish? It's like run by young people, kind of youth ministry, and they go around from parish to parish, and they put on a retreat, and they usually play lots of guitar music, and they get everybody worked up, and people are emotional, and they tell stories and whatever. And they go around doing this. This is kind of their model. Well, this group of students at Wyoming Catholic College, they want to start something like that, but with traditional Catholic values, doctrines, and practices instead. And what they want to do is go around to parishes. Obviously, they have to be invited, so it'd have to be a forward-thinking pastor who did this. They'd have to be invited to go there, but come there and work with the youth and teach them how to do Vespers or how to do morning prayer, and have a Mass with them, a high Mass. Teach them how to sing some basic Gregorian chant. Pray the Rosary, maybe in front of Eucharistic adoration, right? But to do all these things in a way that is introducing them to all these beautiful things that Catholics have and do. And my experience has been, at least I know that my experience has been a little bit different because I'm working with largely conservative people. But when I meet somebody who has never heard of chant and they start singing it, they usually fall in love with it because it is very beautiful and it's very singable and it's very satisfying. And so I think it's these kinds of initiatives that we have to be doing to take things on the road and introduce a lot more people to them. I just wish that the hierarchy of the church would be as supportive of these ideas as the lay people often are. But I mean, there are some. It sounds like you have a very good archbishop here. So,
there was a quote you made in your crucifixion section of your talk where you talked about the heart of Mary and the heart of Jesus. And references to the Holocaust several times.
yes.
Where did that quote come from?
Yes, thank you for asking. I was hoping somebody would ask about that. So there's a book that's just recently been published called In Sinu Jesu. When Heart Speaks to Heart, the Journal of a Priest at Prayer. That's the full title. In Sinu Jesu, When Heart Speaks to Heart, the Journal of a Priest at Prayer. It's published by Angelico Press. It just came out. Actually, it was just announced a few days ago, so just before this. The reason I know about that book is that I was involved in the proofreading, the editorial process of the book, so I'm very familiar with it. And I can tell you that it's certainly one of the most profound books I've ever read. It's a series of, if you will, communications of words of our Lord to a priest. The author is anonymous. And it's our Lord speaking to this priest. And, if you've ever read, Sister Faustina or St. Margaret Mary or anybody like that, it's similar to that, but very, very profound. And it actually touches on a lot of these kinds of questions that people are raising. It doesn't talk a lot about the liturgy explicitly, but it talks a lot about the Eucharist and the manner in which we're supposed to live out the reality of the Eucharist in our lives. I can't recommend it highly enough. I think it's an amazing book. So just recommend that. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. How you spoke of Our Lady and relating her to the truths of our faith was extremely beautiful. I have a question. I recently watched a docu-film called A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. And it reminded me of the prophecy of Our Lady at Fatima, when she said that if we don't convert, the heirs of Russia will spread her heirs.
Mhm.
And it showed how, in a very professional way, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it showed how the communist agenda, a Marxist ideology, in a very calculated, planned way, spread their error into the culture of America and into the Vatican Council and into the aftermath, the sort of expression of what it was supposed to be. My question is, do you think that if in the Vatican Council II, as it initially was conceived, that there was an integrity of particulars that could have been preserved and that it was usurped, or that there was something rotten in Denmark from the beginning?
So you're asking me about Vatican II?
Yes, Vatican II.
Oh yeah, just that small question. No, it's fine. I don't know. As time goes on, when I first studied the Second Vatican Council, I was probably reading it for the first time about 25 years ago. My first reaction to reading the documents was, wow, these are really Catholic compared to what I've been hearing, compared to what people have been attributing to the council. You read Lumen Gentium, and it's got all kinds of traditional doctrine in it that nobody ever preaches or talks about, except in a community like this, or similar to it. And you read Sacrosanctum Concilium, and it talks about how Gregorian chant should have pride of place, and the liturgy should remain in Latin, and all this other stuff, right, which also didn't happen. And then you read Dei Verbum, and it talks about tradition and the inerrancy of Scripture. I mean, so when I first was reading the documents of the council, I was impressed by their orthodoxy compared to what had been attributed to the council, the so-called spirit of the council. I have to admit that as time goes on, and I've taught these texts again and again, and I've studied them more, and I've read more about the genesis of the texts, the different drafts and revisions that they went through, and some of the behind-the-scenes work going on at the council, all of which is very well documented, right? This is not conspiracy theory stuff. It's all thoroughly documented. I've become more pessimistic about the council. That is to say, I think that it was... I think that there was a reason why Pope Pius XII did not call a council. He was thinking about calling a council. And one of his closest advisors warned him and said, to call a council when there's not an urgent necessity to do so is to tempt the Holy Spirit, is to tempt God. And so when John the 23rd came along and said, actually, there are no heresies to be corrected, and everything is going really well, but we just need to sort of update the church. That's why we're going to call a council. One could have serious questions about the prudence of doing that and what kind of Pandora's box that would open, especially given that the state of theology at that time was so eclectic and still so sort of tempted towards modernism, just as a matter of record again. So I think that it's not surprising that when the council was opened, there was all the pomp and fanfare, and the Pope was carried in with the ostrich feathers on the backs of his noblemen and so on. And all this stuff happened, and then right away, the liberals took over the council. And it's obvious that that's what happened. They right from the beginning, right, when they said, no, we're not going to go with all these prepared documents. We're just going to start over from scratch. And then, the various... ideologies and machinations and so on that went on there. Not that they were absent from earlier councils, but the way they happened at Vatican II was, I think, particularly troubling. And so, let me just give you an example. The document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, went through many drafts, and in all of its earlier versions, it was loaded with footnotes that referred to all the earlier magisterial documents like Mediator Dei and Mire Caritatis by Leo XIII and the Council of Trent, various decrees from Trent, and so on. It was just bristling with footnotes, which is the way that it should be, so that everybody can see exactly how what the council is saying now is linked to everything that came before, and they can sort of chase the paper trail all the way back to Trent or something like that. Well, in the final session of discussing Sacrosanctum Concilium, right before they were going to put it to the vote, the committee that was in charge of the document, they stripped away all the footnotes except for the scriptural ones. and they submitted it to the bishops for a vote. And it was a last-minute thing. It was an 11-hour thing where it was basically like, okay, the bishops, you're going to have to scrap this entirely, or you're going to have to vote for it, even without the footnotes. And given all that they had been through and their desire to get something done, they all voted for it, even without the footnotes, right? But the fact that all those footnotes were stripped out means that then when you look at the document, it looks like a document that is just sort of sprang out of nowhere, right? It has no antecedents, nothing to follow up on. And that was deliberate. That's just the kind of thing, and there are many examples of that the progressives of the council did in order to, they were steering a course. They were playing the long game, and they wanted to destabilize things and uproot things, and that's the kind of move that they made. So, of course, I don't agree with the Society of St. Pius X that there are actual errors in the documents. I think that the Holy Spirit, my belief as a Catholic is that the Holy Spirit would not permit all the bishops and the Pope to promulgate a document that contained heresy as such. So I think you will try in vain to find an actual heresy in these documents, but what you can find is plenty of ambiguity. You can find plenty of lacunae, gaps. The lack of the footnotes that I mentioned, the strange ways of saying things. In other words, destabilizing elements. Right? You can find those abundantly. So to me, it's not surprising that if the Church is trying to steer her course, it'd be like being on a ship, and the captain says, "Okay, we're in a fog. Where are we supposed to go next?" And then somebody brings to him a bunch of maps that have been scribbled on, and coffee was spilled on them, and everything is blurred. And they say, "Okay, steer by this." Right? I think that's kind of what the documents of the council are like. It's the map, but it's blurry, and you can't really navigate by it. And that's I think half of the reason why, or more than half the reason why, there's still so much confusion, even about what does it mean to evangelize, right? I mean, I think the reason why Catholics, well, there are a lot of reasons. Part of the reason why Catholics are bad at evangelizing is that wherever Catholics have become the majority, like let's say in a country like Italy, where everybody is Catholic, right? That nobody ever thinks of themselves as anything other than Catholic, with the exception of a few Waldensians or something, it makes people sort of lazy, right? Because they take it for granted. It's a little bit like what I was saying, right, about cultural Christianity. Everybody's Catholic, therefore, in a sense, nobody's Catholic, because it's not something they have to fight for. It's not surprising to me that Catholicism tends to be stronger where it's persecuted, which is why maybe I can't help thinking that the good Lord wants to allow a certain amount of persecution of us now, so that we can actually get back in gear, and in fact be serious about our faith. And sometimes it takes a slap in the face to make people wake up and realize, okay, do I really believe this or not? And if I believe it, I have to suffer for it. But the problem with evangelization is, if you think that evangelization means taking the gospel or church doctrine or liturgy and adapting it to contemporary secular culture, because by doing so, you're supposedly going to sort of baptize and Christianize the popular culture and win people over that way. That's one model. The other model is what the missionaries always followed, which is, we will bring to you this rich religion and heritage and faith that we have. In a sense, we have the answers to your questions, right? And we're going to bring it to you, and hopefully, right, with God's grace, you'll fall in love with it and you'll become Christians with us. So sort of like, who's really the boss? Is it contemporary culture, or is it the Christian faith? And I think that there are two radically opposed models of evangelization right now. And that's why if somebody says new evangelization, you have to stop them and say, what do you mean by evangelization, right? What is this going to look like? What's really in charge, secular culture or the Christian faith?
I think we'll go two more questions. You were trying, and then...
Anyway, we have to end.
Pardon?
Do we have to end?
Do we have...
People can leave if they want, but do we have to?
Oh, I think one of the things that we looked at with this meeting and was that as long as there seemed to be questions, we would continue. but I know some of you may have plans, or no one's going to be offended if you get up and leave. We know you're not walking out in disgust. You couldn't possibly.
We haven't gotten to that point
I
yet.
have to tell you, though, that if you stay any longer, and the longer he speaks, we're all going to be eligible for credits at his college.
No, I'd love to, if you have more questions.
We really shouldn't be surprised at what's happening in the church, because ever since the fall of the angels, there's been this major battle between good and evil, and then since the fall of Adam. But I think I don't know my church history well enough to know if there's been a time like ours when all these the Vatican Council happened in the 60s, as well as the really upturning of society and all the the me and the freedom and all this. I mean, they were coinciding. The devil's really smart. He's really smart.
Yes.
You know, and that has really influenced the whole way of thinking of society. And so
Yes.
the Catholic Church really has society is even a greater force against her than it used to previously.
Yes, so you were making the point that the Second Vatican Council happened at the worst possible time, which is true. That is, even if you take the most charitable, optimistic reading of the council and say everything was fine, they fought with each other in the council, but that always happens, and the 16 documents that came out are just great. So even if that's the position you take, the fact is that all of this happening between 1962 and 1965 meant that when the documents finally came out, they were going to be interpreted through the lens of 1968 and everything that happened leading up to that and following from that. In other words, I mean, I think this is Pope Benedict XVI's position, that there was a distorting filter or mechanism that shredded the authentic meaning of the council, that prevented it from being received properly by the church, so that essentially the council was sort of like it was like something in aspic. It was frozen there. It couldn't be accessed. Afterwards there was a kind of false message that came out because of the society, because of the culture, because of the revolutions. And that's a defensible position. It's not my position, but it's definitely nobody can deny that the late 60s warped everything in such a way that nobody was really seeing clearly. It's like everybody was drugged, at the same time. It's probably true in some places.
A recent Vatican news was that a red hat was awarded to one who supports women priests.
Mm-hmm.
So then was glaringly bypassed was Archbishop Chaput of Pennsylvania. So then, how can you relate that to Mama Mary's statement of do whatever he tells you?
What do you mean exactly?
No, it's what you mean. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that I'm not going to defend Pope Francis's actions. I mean, or his choice of cardinals. I think the choice of cardinals was fairly scandalous in many ways, both who was there and who was not there on that list. But what can I say? I mean, he has the freedom to do that, right? He has freedom to appoint cardinals. The church is never going to ordain women priests. I mean, even Pope Francis said that recently, right? And of course, it is sort of amusing to see how fickle public opinion is, right? I mean, Pope Francis is sort of everybody's favorite as long as he seems to be saying what they want to hear. And every once in a while he says something that they don't want to hear. And then people either tear out their hair or they just ignore him, right? I mean, that is the news doesn't report on Francis when he says things that sound like what Roman Catholics always say. They only report on him when he says things that tickle the ears of the modern liberal West. But I mean, apart from that, I don't, it doesn't matter how bad cardinals, popes, or bishops are. The fact is that the faith handed down to us cannot be changed by them. They can huff and puff, but they're not going to be able to blow the house down.
Well, thank you, Mr. Peter.
Welcome. I don't know if that's what you were thinking about. But.
Nice and short.
Yes, this will be short. It's more a comment than anything else. I was speaking to a theater and venue promoter yesterday who does a lot of work in New York City, and we were talking about music, and I was actually particularly talking about my music and saying, well, it's a limited audience because it's in Latin mostly. And he stopped me and he said, you know what I found is that amongst young people, but also especially from the 30 to 55, and he uses demographics because he has to book these places. From 30 to 55, he's found that a lot of people are looking back to earlier forms of music, and they don't necessarily have to understand the language that it's in, but they're it's like they're uncovering these treasures that haven't that has been hidden from them for all these years. And so a lot of bands are incorporating music back in the, not just classical, but Baroque, Renaissance, and medieval and Gregorian chant in their music. And people are latching onto it and really enjoying it. And so I'm just making that as a comment. I think this is a time, this is really a right time for us to properly evangelize through our liturgy, our Western liturgy.
No, it's true. I want to affirm the truth of that by reference to Decca Records. I think you've probably all heard of that label. Decca has a particular, I don't know if you'd call it imprint or spin-off or whatever, called Montfort Records. And Montfort Records that's the company that is putting out all the CDs from the monks of Norcia, from the Benedictines of Ephesus. I don't know if you've seen these things. The Benedictine nuns of Ephesus from Missouri have recorded now, I think, 6 or 7 CDs, professionally recorded and marketed by a major international record company. And they're selling well. That's why they've done 7 of them, right? And this company also came and did a record with the monks of Norcia in their basilica before it collapsed, alas. And I have that recording too. Actually, I have a bunch of these recordings. They're excellent musically speaking. But what fascinates me is that they climb up the Billboard charts, and people buy these things. People who aren't believers, who don't understand Latin, they want the beauty that they hear in the music. They want the serenity. Yes, maybe what they're looking for initially is a kind of emotional state or something, and yet that's also a preparation for the gospel. That's also a way of tilling the soil for the seed. I think it's clear that in a world where there's so much noise, John Paul II makes this point, in a world with so much noise, people are desperate for peace. They're desperate for silence. And chant, in a most wonderful way, manages almost to be like music with silence built into it. It sort of has that amazing quality, even in a way that polyphony doesn't have. So yeah, it's not surprising to me that people are. I mean, the human heart is made. It's like Augustine saying, right? You made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And because anything beautiful reflects God in some way, right? It's a path to God. Yeah. No, it's true. There was actually a really good document. A lot of these pontifical documents, I don't mean I mean like the Pontifical Council for X, Y, and Z. There are all of these different groups in the Vatican. And sometimes the documents they produce are just a lot of verbiage. But there's one from the Pontifical Council of Culture from, 10, 15 years ago, called the Via Pulchritudinis, Privileged Path of Evangelization, or something like that. But this whole document is about how important beauty is in evangelizing people, and it's amazing for the Pontifical Council of Culture. But you should check this out sometime if you're interested in this particular angle. They say, for example, that a liturgy that is too much caught up with words only, and doesn't have moments of beauty in it that appeal to us in a deeper than rational way, right? A deeper than verbal way, is not going to be effective at reaching people and touching them. Right? To me, in a way, it's kind of self-evident, and yet a lot of self-evident things are maybe not so evident anymore. So, yes.
And just following up on that, there is some sort of innate desire for the sacred and the beautiful, and it manifests itself in different ways. A very brief story, which I hope you will find edifying. Some of my friends here will have heard this story from me already, but I've been very blessed in that my wife and I have 4 children, 10 years and younger, and none of my 4 children have ever been to a Novus Ordo Mass. They don't know what it is. They wouldn't recognize it, so to speak. About 3 years ago, I was with my eldest child, our eldest daughter, and we'd been out running some errands. On the way back, I said, let's pop into this church, which is near our home. We're about half an hour away from here. And I said, let's just go in for a quick prayer, which we did. We were there for about 10 minutes in total, prayer, got back in the car and drove home. And my daughter said to me, she was about 7 years old or so at the time, she said, Papa, I've got 2 questions for you. And I said, sure, what's that? She said, what's that table thing in the front, and where's the tabernacle? And I thought, out of the mouths of babes and all that sort of thing. And I thought, this is a child who recognizes there is something askew, there's something wrong there, even though she doesn't know what it is necessarily. There's sort of an innate knowledge that there's something wrong there.
Yes. Well, I have to say that for the out of the mouths of babes file, I have a bunch of things in there. One,
add that one to your
yes,
collection.
thank you. I will. One of my favorites is the. I know this family that always attends the traditional Latin Mass, but every once in a while, because of some scheduling conflict, they have to go to a regular English Mass. But they said one weekend, okay, kids, this weekend we have to go to the English Mass, and the 8-year-old girl said, but Daddy, I don't understand that Mass. Right? Which I think is so great, because it's not about verbal understanding, right? It's like the ceremonies spoke to her, and when she gets to the English Mass, it's blah 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 blah, all this stuff, and it's for a little kid, it's over their head, right? In a way. So I think the Latin Mass can actually speak to children very well, not on a verbal level, but in other ways that the Novus Ordo doesn't. The other out of the mouth of babes story is now this is not really a babe anymore, but my daughter, who's 14, we were having a conversation about the year of mercy, and she said, Pope Benedict should call a year of orthodoxy. So anyway.
I promise to. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Considering the statements that the Pope has made about traditional Catholics and the news about the change in the composition of the congregation for divine worship, do you see anything coming at us down the road at some point that traditional communities should be prepared to face and maybe even endure?
Don't think they heard her back there.
Yeah, so she's asking if the changes in the Congregation for Divine Worship and other similar things should make us nervous about what's coming in the future. Well, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I don't have any inside connections, and the inside connections I have don't know anything more than has already been reported by the news. But it seems to me that Pope Francis is not going to be able to stop the momentum that the traditional movement has, because it's global, it's all over the world. I mean, I've seen it in so many different places, in so many different countries, and it's unstoppable because it's a grassroots movement, and it's got lots of youth and energy behind it. And if you look at the way that the religious communities are growing that are attached to it, they have a growth rate that can't be matched by any of the mainstream orders, which are dying out in many cases. So it's not as simple as saying that there's a demographic solution, but I think that there is this huge momentum in that direction. Huge, by the way, I don't mean in terms of absolute numbers. It's very small in absolute numbers. But I mean just sort of like the spiritual momentum. That is, if you could put in a scale, like if you had a balance scale and you took the commitment to the faith of a traditionally minded Catholic, and then you took 100 typical Catholics, it would tilt in the direction of the traditional Catholic. And not because he's better, but just because he's more committed, more serious, more knowledgeable, more energetic, loves his faith, knows it, wants to promote it. And the mainstream ones often are not that way. Obviously, there are always exceptions. So I'm just saying that he basically we could see a lot of, I guess what P.G. Woodhouse would call it, throwing spanners in the works, that there could be a certain... we could have technical difficulties, but it's not something, I mean, it's not like he could just sort of, especially given what Benedict XVI said, for a pope to stand up and actually say, I abolish the Tridentine Mass. I mean, even Paul VI didn't do that. And even if Francis tried it, I don't think people would listen to him, frankly, at this point. And it's sort of ironic that, in a way, the progressive approach, which is to tell people to think and do as they please, makes it impossible for them in the end to really exercise their authority. That is, they've prepared their own bed and they have to sleep in it now, right? So if Pope Francis stood up and said, "You can't do this," the attitude is, well, who are you to say that we can't do this, right? I mean, I'm not saying necessarily that this is the best scenario. We should have a much more peaceful relationship. But I think what it shows is that Catholics, when they're pushed around and yanked around too much, they respond by saying, no, we're going to hold fast to what has always been sacred and beautiful, as Benedict said. And it doesn't matter what you think on this topic. So I think that the Pope, there's another way of putting it, is the Pope's authority is limited. And that's something that it amazes me how few Catholics recognize the fact that the Pope is not some kind of absolute monarch whose will is law. I mean, again, I'm just basically quoting Benedict XVI. He said the Pope is not an absolute monarch who's above the faith, but he's beneath the faith, he's beneath the tradition, he's supposed to care for it. And so popes can overstep their authority, and they can say things that don't have force, right? And that's happened before, it can happen again. So
You balanced your budget, but I don't know what his overtime rates are. Father Ashley, I'll give you the last word, and I'm sorry, but we have to.
Okay, no, I just thought I'd add one little thing I think is an element to the answer to the lady's question here. Whatever his faults are, Pope Francis seems to be quite serious about reconciling the Society of St. Pius X. Mm-hmm. I would tend to think he's not going to touch the traditional liturgy, because that will make that impossible. So there's a political element there I think he would tend to. So I'll leave some warm pontificum alone, because I want the Pius X Society back. If I do anything to touch the traditional liturgy, they'll get mad and will never be in agreement. I think that's probably in his mind.
Yes.
At least I would hope.
I think that's true. And I also think that it sounds like some of you maybe read Hilary White. I don't know any of you do. But, I think that Hilary, I know her personally. We're friends. I think she's too pessimistic, even for me. She's too pessimistic. Because what I think she might not be seeing in the case of the SSPX, she thinks that it's a trap, that the Pope is trying to lure the SSPX in so they can smash them or something like that. And my response to that line of argument is, whatever he thinks is going to happen, God is smarter than he is, right? And so if the SSPX gets back to the church, Francis is not going to be Pope forever. And that's going to completely change. I mean, if you suddenly add hundreds of traditional priests, and I think even millions of faithful to, back to the church, to join the traditionally minded Catholics who are already in full communion with the church, that's a potent force for good. Whatever he might be intending by that, whatever his motivations are, I don't care what the motivations are. That's a good step. That would be a great step if that happened. And I hope and pray that does happen. Because I do think that if the SSPX remains separated for much longer, they will end up, as St. Jerome said. St. Jerome said, the worst thing about schism, not that I'm necessarily asserting that they're in schism, but I'm just saying, he says the worst thing about schism is that people who are cut off have to invent for themselves a heresy that justifies why they're separated. And so in a way it's like the Eastern Orthodox. I'm sorry if this is going to bother anyone, but I think it's like the Filioque dispute in this way, that it's absolutely clear from many high-level theological discussions over many centuries that the East and the West don't actually disagree about the procession of the Holy Spirit. But the East has, the Mount Athos Eastern, the really hardcore Eastern ones, they have to insist that we disagree about the Filioque, otherwise they couldn't remain separate from us, right? So I think that it's the SSPX, if they don't get together in full communion, they are going to end up in some kind of really weird place, which would be very sad. That would be very tragic. Okay, sorry.
Okay, well, Listen, folks, we do have a couple of housekeeping items that I'll mention just before you leave, and we'll have a short prayer. But I just want to, please come back over here, Peter. You made a reference to Benson and the notion of pessimism and optimism. Did you know the difference between the two is the pessimist or the optimist says that this is the best of all worlds, and the optimist is afraid he's right. So, not to trivialize your words, because we are so enriched by your address to us today, and I think it could go much longer. I think you made reference at the very beginning that we're getting just a chunk of the vast knowledge and wisdom that you possess. And it isn't just having that knowledge and wisdom, it's the ability to pass it on and share it with us. So we're ever so grateful for your presentation, and I'm sure, like myself, you feel very enriched with what you had to say to us today, and very encouraging. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you.